This is the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined here today by Professor McClay. He is a historian and professor at Hillsdale College. He wrote an excellent book chronicling American history entitled The Land of Hope, an Introduction to the Great American Story. Professor McClay, thanks so much for being with me.
I'm very happy to be here, Ashton.
Appreciate it. So,
we've been trying to set this up for a while,
yeah.
So I'm glad we can finally do it.
I'm very glad as well. Let's start off with the title of your book, and we'll take it from there. So, The Land of Hope. Why is the United States the land of hope? Because as far as I've been told, that it's a white supremacy colonial empire founded by horrible racists, formed for the preservation of the institution of slavery. Or has the New York Times been lying to me? Why is the land of hope?
Yeah, well, I mean, it sheds a light on this to think about the fact that people making these accusations occupy, some of the highest positions at the most powerful newspaper record in the country. It doesn't quite jibe. But, no, look, I think Land of Hope is it's actually the first thing I wrote in writing this book, because I wanted to have a guiding image for what is the source of America's distinctiveness and greatness and in human history. And it did seem to me that was the thing for me, the single most powerful distinguishing characteristic, that this is a country in which, for the most part, people we're an aspirational country. And that what that means is that we believe, all of us, I think, there's almost a consensus about this, that no one should be condemned to spend their lives chained to the conditions of their birth. And yes, this is an ideal that has never been perfectly realized, but that it has been attempted and largely realized as an expression of opportunity. Is phenomenal, and I think we need to pay tribute to that. And we need to recognize, in the vast scale of human history, that how unprecedented this is for individuals to have the kind of scope of opportunity that they have. That no one's required to be defined in terms of their material goals, in terms of their religious professions. In terms of their ethnic identity, even by conditions of birth. So there's room, there's space for aspiration here, and aspiration is something that has no end. So obviously, the hope can never be completely realized, and when you have opportunity, you also have the opportunity to fail. That's part of what we are too. To be an opportunity society means that success is not guaranteed. But this aspirational quality is what draws people across the seas, and often in perilous voyages, to come here, and draws them even now, even as we speak. And if we were this terrible racist country, why would anybody want to come here? Why wouldn't they not want to flee pell-mell in the opposite direction? But that's not what happens. And within the country itself, we're a boisterous, ever-moving, ever-striving society. In America, it's parents want to see their children exceed them. That's quite a remarkable thing. That we feel that if our children don't surpass us in some ways, we haven't really fully succeeded. That's a beginning of there are lots of other ways. I think it also is a title that helps to hint at least the importance of religion, of religious hope, and in the American story, and hope that's expressed in a this worldly way, but is informed by Christian and Judeo-Christian aspirations. So that's for starters.
So let's start in the beginning. What was so revolutionary about the founding of the United States, particularly in its implementation of the Constitution and promulgating this idea of natural rights and the Bill of Rights that everybody has them.
You've just said part of it, that nobody had ever created a nation that had such a basis, that it was Republican in a large, on a continental scale. When Tocqueville came to America in the early 19th century, he said, "I went over to see an example of a great republic." What he meant was a big republic, a grand republic, and there'd never been anything like it before, and that in its constitutional structure forswore monarchy. There was never going to be a king. George Washington might have been able to secure that for himself had he wanted to, but he was committed to the Republican, small r Republican, the Republican ideal. So, and the notion of natural rights that is very much woven through the founding period. Although there are lots of other influences too. There are religious influences. There are English influences from English common law. In many ways, the single most important driver of the revolution was the belief that American colonists were Englishmen who were being deprived of their memorial rights, their inherited rights as Englishmen. So that ironically, they were rebelling against the British Empire in order to secure the rights that they had as Englishmen.
They took it a step farther. It wasn't simply that they were being denied rights as Englishmen. They also basically enumerated other rights that they deemed were natural that people are ordained with. And how unusual was that relative to everybody else in history up until that point?
Well, sure, it was quite revolutionary, quite different. Now, it's the rights that Jefferson talked about in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And presumably there are other natural rights, but they're not mentioned there. That's distinct from the Bill of Rights, making up the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, most of which come from English common law. And there was a debate. Madison himself wasn't really sure it was such a good idea to have a Bill of Rights, because whenever you start enumerating rights, what isn't enumerated, what isn't stated, is that there can be a presumption that it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So that, for example, let's just say the right to marriage. Did that need to be in there? No, of course not, because that something was presumed. But a later time might look at the matter differently. So there was some debate about whether you should enumerate the rights in the Bill of Rights. But anyway, yes, I think natural rights is one of the profound, founding a nation on the notion that everyone has certain natural rights, and natural rights being kind of equivalent to God-given rights effectually. Not that nature and God are the same thing. They sort of were for Jefferson, but they weren't for everybody. They weren't for most of them. But these were rights that could not be taken away by government. They were inalienable rights, and that language is in the Declaration. And we don't often think about what that means. Inalienable rights are rights you actually can't give up. Right.
Not even for a pandemic?
It's not even for a pandemic. Okay. Well, you can violate the rule of nature. We do that all the time.
Right.
But no, not justifiably. So it was establishing the rights that were being, abrogated by Parliament and the King as having a source beyond their reach in nature. So that was, and Jefferson was very learned when it came to the English common law and all of that. But I think he knew what he was doing when he was using nature and nature's God as the basis for the rights in the Declaration.
Now, with respect to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, where did they get their inspiration from? So you mentioned English common law. Obviously, England doesn't have a constitution, so this is the first time in basically human history where making this the backbone, the foundational structure by which to create this democratic republic, just so far beyond what anybody has ever attempted before. I mean, Greece had democracy, but which lasted, well, Athens did, which lasted a short period of time. But doing this on a nation state level through a democratic republic and enumerating these rights, like things like due process, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, the Fifth Amendment right. Where did they get inspiration for these things? Was it just English common law? Was it from the Romans? Was it bits and pieces from the Romans? I know that our founding fathers had a conversation with someone the other day about the Iranian Revolution, and we were talking about Cyrus the Great. And I know that a couple of our founding fathers were admirers of his, and he's sort of credited with having, maybe the first human rights declaration, which was, freedom to worship. What are sort of the bits and pieces that you're aware of that they sort of took from in making this Bill of Rights?
Well, I think one way to answer your question is to look at what how in the process the notion of a Bill of Rights as amendments to the Constitution arose. It's kind of an odd way of doing it. If you were, could just pick a way of doing it, you'd just include it in the body of the document. And this is why I think it's really important to acknowledge the role of the anti-federalists, those who opposed the adoption of the Constitution, who are, often seen as, one of the examples of history's losers. But they weren't entirely, because they did, they were afraid of certain things about the Constitution, that it was, they actually objected to its being secular. Many of them, not all of them. There wasn't a unified anti-federalist doctrine, but there was definitely concern about the concentration of power in the hands of particularly of a president. The convention, probably felt more comfortable about that than they might have otherwise, because they knew that George Washington was going to be the guy and that he would execute it well, which of course he did. More than well. These first 10 amendments of the Constitution were primarily drafted to answer the concerns of anti-federalists, of those who were concerned that fundamental rights would be trampled upon unless there was some sort of explicit defense of them. That says a lot about the character. And if you think of each one of the 10 amendments as in some way answering some present threat or difficulty at the time. You think of the right to bear arms in relation to, and quartering of soldiers. This is going right back to the occupation in Boston prior to the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So a lot of these, come less from principle, although they're grounded in principle, than from specific response to offenses that the empire, the British Empire, perpetrated upon the colonists, and that the people did not want to see repeated again. So they represented a way of defending against that happening.
I see. Okay, so a lot of it was just based on rights that they feel were being trampled on, and making sure that this new country that's being formed ensures that those rights are defended by enumerating them into the Constitution.
Something interesting that if I could point out, that because there is an English-British sort of foreground to this in the all of the wars of the 17th century, all the conflict that eventuates in the Glorious Revolution and the British coming to the sort of constitutional monarchy, sort of limited monarchy with parliamentary control of the royal power, and that's a very important prelude to all this. And there was a Bill of Rights to come out of that process. The interesting thing is, Edmund Burke makes this argument that the British Bill of Rights, it should be understood as grounded in inheritance. These are rights that were established by the fathers, by the forebears, and inherited by their successors. When Jefferson talks about natural law, if it's natural, that doesn't mean it's dependent on inheritance. Mm-hmm. So that is something that's genuinely new, as is the whole idea of a written constitution. It's kind of extraordinary how important that is, and we don't talk a lot about it. We see Independence Day, July 4th, fireworks, all kinds of wonderful stuff. Constitution Day, September 17th. Many people don't even know the date. We don't do anything. We have lectures on college campuses in which people often decry the Constitution as praise it. Right. But it's an extraordinary thing to have a written Constitution, because a written document is something that theoretically any Tom, Dick, and Harry who can read can consult and point to and say, "Here, look, I know my rights. Here's what it says." Instead of having to depend on, the nothing against lawyers, mind you, but having to depend on a sort of specialized quasi-priestly legal profession to interpret all of those things.
Absolutely. So, and not only was it radical in the implementation of these rights, which were really crazy. I mean, even by today's standards, people don't. Countries don't abide by these concepts of being able to worship freely. Like, there are many Islamic countries, or some Catholic countries even there.
Oh, sure.
Don't have a separation between church and state. The right against self-incrimination. The due process rights, as we mentioned, the right to have a counsel and a speedy trial, the right to accuse your witnesses. I mean, so these are such. I mean, we're talking about the 18th century. These are such a huge leap forward in the United States. And so this leads to kind of question that I want to get to with you, which is, I grew up in Los Angeles, so even before critical race theory was officially a thing, it was a thing. They just didn't call it that.
Oh, yeah.
But to the extent of this incredible emphasis on the wrongs that America was committed, particularly when you get to the high school level and things like AP World History and AP U.S. History, with slavery, with the Native American treatment, which of course have to be discussed. There's no debate about that. No reasonable person can debate that. But the other things also need to be discussed. And one of the issues I realized was, okay, well, all the uniquely American achievements that made it possible to the extent there's freedom anywhere in the world, it's only because of America. We could look at that from a military context in terms of saving the world from World War II and communism. But even before that, the countries that followed in our footsteps to have a free society, a democratic society, were inspired by America, were aided in many cases by America. So to the extent freedom exists anywhere in the world, it's because of the United States. And so but the way they would frame things would be that they universalized every unique American achievement, right? So man on the moon is a human achievement. To the extent they say anything positive about the Constitution, it's a human achievement, right? The implementation of civil liberties and human rights, these are human achievements. The polio vaccine is a human achievement. None of these things would be possible in America. But then all the things that America took part in, which were disgraceful, which was a sort of disgraceful condition of our species, things like slavery, which existed 10,000 years before the United States even became a country and lasted for about 70, 80 years after the Constitution was ratified and continues to exist to this day. Those things are attributed directly to America as if that's some sort of American phenomenon, whereas there's nothing unique about slavery. It's a deplorable, disgusting thing that's happened for thousands of years, and America, like virtually every other place on this planet, took part in it, but America actually fought a war to end it. And since the Constitution was ratified, you're talking 70, 80 years. There's nothing in Spanish history. So my question is, do you see that the teachings of history, particularly American history, particularly in the K through 12 setting and society, being shaped by people like Howard Zinn and the 1619 Project, do you see that as sort of being corrupted by these kinds of people? Because that's the mindset that I grew up with, that I was taught by, neglecting all the amazing, unique things about the United States.
I think you're right, and I think even people who don't know much, which is most people, or haven't really studied American history, there's a kind of default position. Actually, let me. let me put it this way: that when I first started studying American history, there was what I would call a default position. And as a teacher, you would ask a student a question, you'd give a writing assignment. Why did Andrew Jackson feel the way he did about the Bank of the United States? And the student didn't know what to say. They didn't know. So what are you going to do? Well, you fake it, and you fake it by going back to what I call the sort of all-purpose default, which is to say something to the effect of, well, Andrew Jackson was a man. He had strong views. He had student paper writing, and then you end up with what I call stars and stripes forever. You sort of say, well, because America's the greatest nation in the history of the world, and blah 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 blah. Ta-dum, ta-dum. And now, some 4 decades later, there's still a ignorant default position. It's just that, well, America's too arrogant, it's too proud. And Andrew Jackson, going back to that stupid question, Andrew Jackson exemplified this pride and irrationality and so on. So it plays on the America as villain sort of trope, whereas the first default was America as, pure as the driven snow. Neither one is true.
Yeah.
And look, when I wrote Land of Hope, I can't tell you how many times I talked to people, both historians and just regular people. And the first thing I'd say, well, how are you going to handle Indian removal? How are you going to handle slavery? How are you going to handle the Japanese internment? Those are sort of the big three. And I kind of felt like asking you, was that all you know about?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great and important thing for us to have the strength as a people to acknowledge our faults. But
Absolutely.
I think there's a great difference between remembering or consciousness of something and endlessly brooding about it or wallowing in guilt about it when there's actually nothing really to be done about the past. And the way this concept of equity now is that it's this equality plus remediation of every evil, real or perceived, in the past, and then you have equity. Well, that's really a negation of the whole American idea of not being encumbered by the weight of the past. And what I began with, being a land of hope, means that in some way America is a sort of land of jubilee in the biblical sense, that a land in which we're not, our lives aren't determined by the weight of the past. There's an openness to possibility. That's one of the things that's so terrible about critical race theory and its many antecedents. Because you're right, it was around in one form or another, 30 some years ago when I was a graduate student. It just didn't have a name, but it actually was already conditioning the responses of an awful lot of people in the historical profession. And I just always was different. I went to graduate school later, and I think wasn't as completely formed by the academy in my views. I actually worked with the U.S. Navy for a while. That probably had made a big difference in my life. But I wasn't in the Navy, but I worked as a civilian with the Navy as an editor. But yes, look, I think what we lack is not a knowledge of our sins, but a sense of perspective on them. I don't want, one of the things I fear actually may come out of this whole period of brooding and sort of projecting the sense of sin onto others in order to get it off our own backs, which I think a lot of the woke, movement is about. What it could eventuate in is a complete cauterization of the conscience of people who will get to a point where they're tired of feeling guilty about things that they really shouldn't feel guilty about.
Right.
I really shouldn't feel guilty about the deeds of people who were not my forebears in Indian removal or some other, or slavery, I mean,
Right.
my entire lineage is north of the Mason-Dixon line until I grew up in Maryland, but long after that. But
It also gets annoying, right? I mean, like, so I agree with you. I think that the tide will shift. And Howard Zinn theme, which permeated throughout, particularly, like, I would say the California education system, and was a precursor to the whole critical race theory thing. You're looking at everything as a sort of a grievance from a sort of ethnic perspective. And he was, of course, a communist. If all you're hearing is just this, like, depressing, guilty, sombering story, you're just gonna, like, tune it out. Like, it's like you have to, it's like watching a movie that's nothing but depression. You have to throw in some good stuff. You have to throw in some comedy. You have to, right?
And it's look, I think this is what leads to the attractiveness for a lot of young people, the alt-right, that they think are, trying to elicit a sense of guilt in people over the very fact of their existence. That's ultimately, asking people to sort of extinguish themselves. And I want to give you an expression. I don't use vulgarity lightly. I'm kind of the last holdout in this regard, but I'm going to use a vulgar expression that I can't somehow involve Brandon in it. So, but I'll just give you the straight words. But first, let me tell you who said them. Eugene Genovese was probably the greatest American historian of slavery, who was white and a Sicilian, Italian Sicilian immigrant and a Marxist for most of his life. A very interesting guy and a great writer. But he said to me once, and I think he said this in print to various places, but I remember it because he looked at me. He was known for being both incredibly perceptive about the inner life of slaves. He wrote a book called Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made. And it was really about that. Extraordinary book. He also wrote a book called The Mind of the Master Class. He had a kind of interest in the other side of that and what kind of worldview brought that about. And he always had a respect for Southern white culture, which you might not have expected, even as he had an immense affinity for African-American culture. So this was an extraordinary thing about Gene. He had many extraordinary things. But he said this to me. He said, no man should be required to piss on the grave of his father. And I think that's part of the problem where we are right now. When people pull down statues, and they do it for the very reason that those who erected them, or the descendants of those who erected them, will be hurt, will be outraged, will be wounded, will be made angry by the act, especially if it's a violent, a lawless act. When you have a situation where that's the actual reason that people are doing it, they are, in effect, saying, we're going to piss on the grave of your father. And nothing good can come of that. Nothing.
Absolutely.
What we've always needed to think about more clearly is reconciliation. Lincoln himself, who fought the Civil War ferociously, at the very end, and I quote this in my book, at his last cabinet meeting, he said, well, now, I trust there will be no effort to kind of effect kind of vengeance and humiliation of the South, of the white South, that there's already been too much of that. He really did want to bind the nation together. And then, of course, along comes John Wilkes Booth and his assassination, and that his vision was not, we didn't have a chance to see if he could implement it. But I think this is all so horribly counterproductive to unearth corpses from 150 plus years ago in order to pee on them one last time. And look, it's not just Robert E. Lee. It's not just Stonewall Jackson or these kind of figures.
Well, it's Lincoln too.
It's Lincoln.
It's even Lincoln now. I mean, it's
Douglas.
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass is because he and it's what's her name? The great feminist that worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, because she felt that women's suffrage was more important than black male suffrage. All these anachronistic debates are treated as if they are contemporary in character. And meanwhile, excuse me, I'm getting on my soapbox here, but meanwhile, the New York Times, going back 400 years ago, to excoriate the country for being founded in slavery, and something she has both continues to assert and claims she never said. But in the meantime, we have the largest number of enslaved people in the world today. Many tens of millions. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but the UN has a commission that keeps track of this. I think 23 million enslaved people, and
I heard 30 million last time. Yep.
Yeah, and we have a situation in which the economy of our country is heavily dependent on what is in fact slave labor on the other side of the world, and that's something we don't even see fit to talk about. No, let's talk about 400 years ago.
Right.
It's bizarre.
Let's make up facts about 400 years ago on top of that. Yeah.
So, and I'm a historian. I care about the past. I spend a lot of my life living in the past. It's not that I think the past is unworthy of our attention, but I also, we live forward. We study history partly to enhance what we are in the present. And not have our morals apply to a situation that happened several hundred years ago and then judged by today's standards, something that people several hundred years ago weren't even sort of tuned to and knowledgeable about, and wasn't part of the zeitgeist of the culture at the time. And then to be so arrogant to think that people several hundred years from now aren't going to do the same thing to us. It's like, oh, so this is the perfect time. This is the zenith of morality, that you can just judge everything there and you're perfect and no one in the future is going to do the same thing to you. That is beautifully put, Ashton. I can't improve on that. What I can tell you is I have several times used an analogy with my classes or just in discussions with young people particularly. And I've said, look, making the point that moral sensibilities evolve and that things that, I can remember, I used to smoke, and I can remember coming into situations where I just light up in people's houses and expect them to bring me an ashtray and things that now it would just be people would be aghast. And that's what everybody did. Right. Now, that's a small thing. That's a small thing. But here's something. I said, when I say moral sensibilities evolve, let me give you this example. Can you not imagine that 50, 75 years from now, moral sensibilities will have evolved in a way and to a degree that we will now not only look upon eating meat and raising animals for the purpose of slaughtering them and consuming them as unspeakable barbarism. That's not hard to imagine. At least,
absolutely.
I don't want to live in such a world, but it's hard. But imagine that the very idea of the domestication of animals is the same way. In other words, you by owning a dog or a cat are complicit in this system of barbaric domination over animals, the animal kingdom, the dignity of animals, their rights, their blah, 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 blah. And they're kind of stunned because they realize that I'm right, that all of this is imaginable, easily imaginable, especially today when we're discovering new rights every day, virtually. I see there's a new right for the minor attracted adults or something like that. This is a new term that's been invented for pedophilia, pedos, and so so moral sensibilities evolve, and they evolve. They're evolving fast in our own time. So can't we have, to go back to your point, a little bit more generosity towards a Thomas Jefferson, who in fact did understand that slavery was unacceptable, that it was really unjust. It was what he lacked was the ability to sort of arrange his affairs in such a way
take the extra step,
Yeah, to get to, and how many of us can relate to all that? I can't stop buying things from Amazon. Even though I'm trying very hard.
Yeah.
Not
So
quite the same thing. But
Jefferson would have been like sort of within the 0.0001% in terms of forward-looking, in terms of his probably more morality and ethics. I don't think that relative to his time period. I mean, slavery was everywhere in the world at that point.
The first anti-slavery movement started in the United States, or in British North America, what was soon to become the United States. I can't recommend enough Sean Wilentz' book, No Property in Man, which I think is a real breakthrough book on this subject, published 2 years ago, I think, or maybe it was last year. And he's a very left-wing historian from Princeton. He's spearheaded both of the impeachment petitions among historians against Trump. And he's not a right winger in any way, shape, or form. But he wrote this book to kind of evaluate the question: was the Constitution a pro-slavery document? And he comes to the conclusion: no, it wasn't. It does have certain protections for slavery. That's not disputable. But it also it is clearly designed to be written in a way that the abolition of slavery is even implicit in it. That's what Frederick Douglass believed. And Madison goes out of his way to avoid using the word slavery, and anything like that. There's the word servitude is used, but that can apply to all kinds of things. And
there was a debate back then, by the way, as well, right? There were people on both sides of that issue, which is rare by human standards in the 18th century.
Yes. So, but you made a point a while back about the ubiquity of slavery, and I think that's really important. That slavery is something that has been a feature of most of human history. That it really has been only in modernity, and maybe and imperfectly, as I pointed out, because much of the world that kind of absolutely destitute servitude exists. It it doesn't have the sanction of law. I mean, slavery is illegal everywhere in the world, technically speaking. But it exists in places like Mauritania. Who's going to come in and root out slavery? It's not going to happen. So 25% of the population of that country is enslaved by any.
Even in a place like the Indian subcontinent, you see that.
So it is this business of establishing, the notion that human dignity is a natural right is a beautiful thing, but it shouldn't be taken to imply that it's our natural state. That is, that we come into the world and like Rousseau's, man is born free, but everywhere is in change. Well, no, freedom is an achievement. Freedom is not a sort of something that is automatically bestowed like the prize to every kid in a t-ball match. It is something that we have to appropriate, we have to work at, and doesn't come automatically. It hasn't been automatic. Victor Davis Hanson has just published this really extraordinary book called The Dying Citizen, which he points out that the idea of citizenship, which is a certain kind of freedom, it may be the noblest kind of freedom, is dying because we don't appreciate how rare and how fragile and how evanescent it is. We don't, the idea of people ruling themselves, which is the essence of the Republican idea, in small r Republican.
Right.
I wish it were large r, but it's only small r. The idea of people ruling themselves it's been around on and off, but the idea of actually making it a reality and making that reality last. Most of the people who wrote about republicanism, going back to Aristotle, back to Machiavelli, and so on, all saw it as an evanescent thing, that it was fragile. It was inherently fragile, and that republics were doomed to last a little while and then flicker out. And there are people who say we long ago ceased to be a republic. I don't accept that myself, and I certainly don't accept that what ways we've lost self-rule are lost forever. I'm just not I'm just not going to lie down and accept that. And I hope as an educator to convince people who read my book, young people and not so young people, that they shouldn't lie down and accept it. I rejoice in things like the school board revolts in Virginia, and
Absolutely.
people kind of getting up on their hind legs and being heard. It's democracy, but it's republicanism. It's people behaving like citizens, and we need to recover that notion that our freedom is most meaningful in the context of a political society that allows us to rule ourselves.
Absolutely. I think a lot of Americans absolutely take it for granted that how fragile it is, right? It's that Reagan quote that we're never more than a generation away from losing the freedom. I think a lot of people that, anecdotally, the people I know who are similar to me in the sense that they're children of immigrants, particularly if they're immigrants from, pretty crappy circumstances and mismanaged countries, they understand that. And that might be why you see a bit of a shifting coalition, right? So, like, for example, to draw it out politically, right? Trump, the only demographic group he did worse in was white men, right? And 40% Hispanics voted for him. And then you had that last election with Youngkin, where I believe he won the Hispanic vote. I do think that we need to understand that a lot of the children of immigrants may be the ones who actually end up saving a republic because they know how it can be. Right,
you won't get any argument from me. That's part of the paradox of what's going on now. I think open borders is a disastrous policy. It's sort of plainly disastrous, and the Democrats are really playing with fire with this in terms of our national future, thinking they can kind of restack the deck of their constituency. Because once people get here and start accumulating some wealth, they change. But more to the point, people like your forebears and mine who came here, land of hope, on a wing and a prayer, and often from circumstances that they would not want to go back to. They're grateful. They're grateful. You ask cab drivers in New York City, who are from places in Africa and Asia and so on, many of them Muslim, and yet they're ferociously pro-American. I can't tell you how many times I've stepped into cabs in New York and found the cabbie playing Rush Limbaugh back when Rush was alive. And I wanted to ask them, hey, what gives here? What are you doing? And they would. I think the de Blasio regime has had a lot to do with that, but they just loathe him. But yes, immigrants. The way I always say it is, immigrants renew the sense of America's promise, and the native-born. It would not surprise me. I've never seen any studies of this, but it would not surprise me to find that a large percentage of the most sort of virulently woke young people are of native stock.
They 100% are. Yeah, they 100% are. I mean, it's I'm in the belly of the beast here. Let me tell you, they are. And there's actually a distinction too. Just to sort of put a bone on this, and I was talking to somebody else about this, because within the Jewish community, you have sort of the sort of white American Jews who have been here for multiple generations, and they're all very left wing. They're still. That's why when you see the polls of 60%, 70% of the Jews support the Democratic Party, it's that demographic. But then you have sort of the Jews from the Middle East who their parents' generation came here from Russia or from Eastern Europe, came after Soviet Union came, or like my mom from Iran. All conservative. So, and it's because they've seen anti-Semitism, they've seen, right? And so, I also don't know I actually don't know an immigrant family who would ever even consider being in favor of defund the police. Like, that's just such an intuitive thing. It's like, wait, you don't want protection from, sure, the police has some problems, but you're not going to have any law and order. You don't want people to call in case things go bad, like they did in my country, right? So, it's absolutely what they call, someone called, I forgot his name, a luxury belief. They're luxury beliefs. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and especially if you're living in a gated community or have a place out in Napa, I'm sure Nancy Pelosi has all of these things. And, and you're not going to be affected. You've got personal security, and you're not going to be affected by the deterioration of your neighborhood. No, it's people of more modest means who can't afford to live in those kinds of communities that bear the brunt of this. It's terrible, and it's sort of obvious that this is wrong. But our media either don't see it or don't want to report it, or their editors don't want to let them report it. That a lot of the content of news is actually the editors telling the reporters what to do.
There's been a shift as well, which has been documented, where in, say, your generation, a lot of the journalists were from working class backgrounds. Their parents were, GM workers and plumbers and things of that nature, electricians. And now the journalists come from elite backgrounds where their parents were college educated and professors and people of that nature. And they grow up in a completely different bubble from people that they're supposed to be reporting to.
We have a real class problem in this country now, and it's not class in the classic Marxian way exactly, because it doesn't correlate exactly with wealth or income level or
That's right.
Ownership of the means of production, maybe ownership of the means of information or communication. But we do have this sort of what I call the college culture, as it sort of ramifies out into all sorts of dominant institutions, including corporate boardrooms. And then you have working people who may not be college educated. Remember when Trump in his first campaign said, "I love the poorly educated," and everybody in sort of our world, the world that you and I move around in, thought that was just the most unbelievably sort of cell phone and statement. I mean, how could anybody say, "I love ill-educated people"? And then you think about why. Well, part of what he was saying in his own way was, "I love people who haven't become, sort of drunk the Kool-Aid of the college culture."
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And who are people who work with their hands, who understand machinery. Look, I was telling you before we started the interview, I'm living in a very sort of country setting here, and I'm not the world's handiest guy. I'm not terrible, but I'm certainly not going to fool around with my own electrical or other stuff that's dangerous. And I have a steady stream of workmen coming through, doing this and that, installing a generator, fixing the lights and the sewage system and so on. And every single one of them, if I ask them, "Who did you vote for president?" I know the answer.
Right.
And they're not all white, by the way. I mean, but every single one of them I know, because the Democratic Party is no longer the party of the working class, and especially the white working class, but not only the white working class. And we're yet to kind of grasp the ramifications of this. I certainly think the Republican Party doesn't understand that it is by default, the party of the working class.
Well, they have to. They're smart. Yep.
They haven't embraced it completely. It was something that Trump did embrace. And look, I respect anybody who has extremely mixed or even negative feelings about Trump, but I think you have to acknowledge there's a way in which he has begun to precipitate the realignment of our parties that needs to take place.
Yes. Yeah.
You asked about polarization. I mean, I think we all can see in certain ways we are very polarized. I don't know that it's the kind of polarization that's going to lead to a civil war or to any kind of meaningful separation. I think we're too intertwined for that, economically and otherwise. But I also think that part of the problem has to do with this process of realignment that is taking place, but has not yet completed itself. And there need to be better representations of the voices of both sides. I think that the right, for lack of a better term, and it does not have a reliable voice. There are definitely avenues, and your blog, your podcast, is going to be one of them for sure. But the alternative media has just had to develop against fierce resistance. And now we're kind of in this situation where with the news world, you tune into one, the Fox world or MSNBC world, and you have entirely different universes. Right. And as a result, when I try to talk to people about things that are going on that are not reported at all. I was with some people the other day, and I said, well, what do you make of Gavin Newsom's disappearance for the last 2 weeks? They didn't know what I was talking about because, you just read the Washington Post or the LA Times or whatever, you wouldn't be aware of it.
Right.
And no one seems at all curious about why he just disappeared for 2 weeks. And there's no big deal. He must have had a good reason. He's a good guy.
With the Rittenhouse case as well, where people actually think he was a white supremacist, didn't know that the people, first of all, self-defense. Secondly, the victims were white, and all had felonies. And one of them is a convicted child molester who has a violent criminal past as well. And people don't know that. And then I had a conversation with a friend the other day, living in a bubble. He's telling me, what do you think of this Rittenhouse thing? Like as if it was some sort of crazy guy, like school shooter kind of situation. I'm like, where are you getting this information from? Going back to that poorly educated comment. So the class thing has an income component to it, but not entirely, because if you I know some, say millionaire contractors from different countries who came here with nothing, from Armenia or Israel or Iran or something like that, Russia. But they're not a part of the upper class, even though the BuzzFeed journalist making like 40 grand a year, that person is a part of the upper class, start putting their nose down on these kinds of people, right? Because it's almost like the Latinx divide, right? The people who use Latinx, that's kind of the elite class, right?
And that's a very tiny group of people, but they do have a megaphone, and they buy ink by the barrel, as they used to say. So, so they have a disproportionate voice. Yeah, I think but I think all of this information asymmetry does a lot to encourage the sense that we're a polarized country, that everybody is on needles and pins in terms of ideological expectations. I don't think that's America. I don't think that's the America we're living in. I think there are a small number of people who eat, drink, and sleep this stuff, but most of us don't. And most people, I want to mention something about my book, Land of Hope, because I wrote it with young people in mind. I wrote it kind of as a textbook. It's a non-textbook textbook. But we've sold about 100,000 or more copies. I don't know what the latest numbers are, but pretty good. And way beyond anything I expected. And the majority of those people, Ashton, are people, over the age of 35 or so. I mean, and well into, older categories. And I get mail from these people all the time. It's unbelievably moving. I feel so blessed. I don't think what I did was that extraordinary, but they do, because I think what they have felt for years is, and this gets back to our opening, what they've felt for years is that the America that they know in their bones is a imperfect but good, fundamentally good place. We've made mistakes. We usually have been able to correct them or improve on them, but our fundamental goodness has never been in doubt for them. And yet they see none of this reflected in the accounts of America that they read, especially books. And along comes a guy who writes something that does affirm that, while being honest about our faults and failings. And I think, if I hadn't been honest about faults and failings, I think people wouldn't be enthusiastic about the book. They don't want just a kind of Valentine to themselves.
Right.
They want the truth, and they want something that can kind of reinforce the sense of this basic, fundamental, deep down, primal pride that they feel in being Americans. And there's no reason they shouldn't have that. That's not a lie. That's the truth. Most of the people who read the book so far have been adults, not school kids, but adults. They were hungry. People were hungry for this. They are hungry for this. And my profession, which is made of a lot of very clever people, some of whom have done really remarkable things, digging out evidence from the past about, marginalized people and so on. And I respect that. I think that's some of it's really quite wonderful work. but it's not the whole story by any means. It is on the periphery of the story, not the core. That's what young people need to know, the core of the story. And they need to know what it takes to be good citizens under our system of government. They don't have a slightest idea. They think that civics is protest movements, is marching in the streets, threatening senators in elevators with being voted out of office. And that's, well, look, I think what the school board protesters are doing is legitimate, and they are threatening them, but they're not doing it in a violent way. But that's what increasingly what schools teach is that it's the only way to get change in this country has been through either violence or at least demonstrations that are outside the political system. No, we have a lot of institutions, political institutions that can mediate conflict. We're just not using them. Mm-hmm. So I'm not resigned to the idea that we're on the track towards perpetual polarization and coming apart. I do think something has to happen to shift our sensibility, and I think some kind of an economic shock is coming. It seems almost inevitable given the astonishing stupidity of our national government and its fiscal policies. You can call them policies even. So I think we are going to get and maybe it's coming right now, 6.2% inflation and probably going to rise. Well, all the experts keep telling us it's temporary.
It's transitory.
There's a collapse of confidence in expertise among ordinary Americans right now. That's part of what's going to effect a change, I think.
Yeah. I'm a naturally optimistic person. I would say that wants to believe that. And then there's a part of me that says, well, this time the two sides, it's not the whole Democratic side for sure. It's at least a sizable portion of individuals in this country, whatever they classify themselves as politically, but who, as we kind of started with, believe the country at its core, and this is what the whole 1619 project was trying to do, is show that the country was rotten from the beginning. That's why they went along that path. The country is inherently bad in its core and its foundational principles, and the Constitution is racist, and the Bill of Rights is nonsense, and people think hate speech isn't covered by the Constitution. And getting back to the point that we are all from different backgrounds, right? Like my lineage is from one part of the world, yours from another, and the only thing I have in common with somebody, a African American from Mississippi or a white guy from Iowa whose family came here on the Mayflower, is respect for the foundation of this country, its laws, what it stands for. We're not Sweden, we're not, Korea, we're not this homogenous society. And so if we can't even come to terms on just the basic foundational principles, maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, because as a historian, it seems like even just going back to the 90s, which I think was a pretty good decade, especially it's pretty rosy right now in terms of the culture. We would argue about Bill Clinton, doing some bad stuff behind the Oval Office, or like tax policy or spending policy and stuff. And I think progressively, ever since the Bush administration and the Iraq War, and then Obama, and now Trump, and now Biden, and it just seems like the sort of foundational core of not even being able to come to terms with basic stuff like due process, like innocent until proven guilty. And that's a part troubles me. And I don't know if you have perspective on that.
Well, they've lost a sense of the rule of law. I think that's a big part of it, that the rule of law doesn't matter when it's your side that's abrogating the rule of law. And that's a fundamental lapse that really no civilized society can last for long if the rule of law is completely tossed out the window. And I think that's partly education. It's partly, interestingly, when I was in graduate school, I became aware of how much historical literature there was, justifying revolts and rebellions and everything except, of course, the Confederacy. The idea that political violence, was really the expression of, and even Martin Luther King said this, that a riot is an expression of people who've been silenced. Words to that effect. And that's that's another part of this phenomenon that I've described of us devaluing our institutions in favor of social movements. Often are just moved by sheer virulent passions, and not by principle. The idea of being guided by principle is something that we have lost, although it's actually hard to get along without. At some point, during the debates, you were too young to have been aware of all this, but when Clinton was impeached, it was so interesting to see the two sides that were coming before the committee and testifying. They were both citing the Constitution. They were both citing the Federalist Papers. They were both citing all these authorities that, Anna Nikole, whatever her name is, Harris, I can't remember her name, the promoters of this extremely negative view of America have no acquaintance with, nothing to, these are the things we go back to when we have to decide. I think for us, the Constitution plays a role that the monarchy does in England, except that it still has power, and the monarchy in England doesn't really have power. But it does. The Queen Elizabeth, who is, I think, is slipping, but for whom I still have great admiration. I think with the death of her husband, she's lost something, a sounding board. But leave that aside. I think she's a great symbol of the unity of the Commonwealth, really, of the British Commonwealth, but the nation, and something that people can kind of recur to that's above politics. I think for us, the Constitution has played that role. It can still play that role. It certainly did for Lincoln. Lincoln saw the preservation of the Constitution as the absolute, the ne plus ultra of the conflicts of his time, and I think it is for us too, a kind of an appreciation of what the Constitution is, what it isn't. The restriction of the monarchical power, which for us now is the presidency, and the separation of powers, the checks and balances, all of this stuff that progressives find so tedious and time wasting. They perform a substantive function in giving a voice to the opposition, and that's part of what we ought to be about, is giving a voice to the opposition. And I fear very much living in a time where the opposition has no voice, where people who object to lockdowns, to taking untested vaccines, especially if they've already had the illness the vaccine's designed to prevent, that these things cannot even be discussed until suddenly one day we wake up and all of a sudden it's okay to discuss the lab leak thesis. And it's just this astonishing.
After we get booster shot number 15, maybe we can.
Yes,
we can
right.
Yeah.
So I a freedom. You quoted Reagan a while ago. It's hard to improve on that. That never more than a generation away. And now, my generation, your generation, too, are kind of on trial.
Yeah, absolutely. Give us, as someone who's chronicled American history, let's finish off here with, give us what you think is the most, if you can pick one, I know there's probably several, but if you could pick one, the most sort of underrepresented or under-discussed, or maybe even mischaracterized, either person or event in American history that you think needs more attention than it currently receives in society and academia? Yeah,
well, gosh, there's a lot because almost everything is being misrepresented.
Right.
My first thought is Calvin Coolidge, because I think this was a remarkably successful president. Emily Schlei's her biography of Coolidge. Everyone should read that. It really gives you insight. He wasn't just a guy who sat around doing nothing, although that would be preferable to what we have now. But he had a real vigorous philosophy, an anti-progressive philosophy. And in my book, he has a speech that he gave on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration while he was president, and it's a beautiful, beautiful speech in which and it's really a counter to Woodrow Wilson and the progressivism of Woodrow Wilson, who I think is coming in for a historical reckoning these days because of his racial views. But I think he's got a lot of blood on his hands, not just that. Also, I think the Adamses, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, both one-term presidents, in the sea of Virginians running, all the way through to James Monroe, and then John Quincy Adams, and then boom. So the Adamses were deemed unsuccessful, but they were men of high principle who, of course, John Quincy Adams had a sort of second life because of his involvement in anti-slavery. After he left the presidency, he came back to the Congress and worked towards for the cause of anti-slavery. So they've been seen as these sort of aristocrats, and I think that David McCullough did a good job kind of beginning a revival of Adams as a sort of judicious and temperate, somebody who recognized the difference between a republic and a democracy. He had that fear of democracy that I think is part of it, being a judicious leader in a democracy. I think all leaders should read Plato's Republic, which is the best critique of democracy ever. Because it's not to say we should abandon democracy. We should know the pathologies of democracy and understand them, and understand how the ways we can ennoble democracy. Oh, that's underrated. In a funny way, Hoover, even though I think Hoover was not a good president, mostly because he was too much of a progressive. Right. But Hoover was a guy. He had a lifetime of public service. From the Belgian relief and things associated with the First World War all the way through the rest of his life, and his presidency was in a sense an interruption of that pattern of public service. And I think he woke up to the dangers of progressivism after FDR and the New Deal, and became much more conservative.
Right. He was a more interventionist candidate. People forget that. When they were both running against each other, he was running on a more interventionist platform than FDR was.
He was, absolutely. That's right.
That's
right.
People,
yeah.
I like that you said Adams as well. I think Adams very much, he had the XYZ affair, which got a stain on his record. But in other ways, he very much exemplified.
The Sedition Act.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. That's right. Yeah. That's what I was thinking of it. Very much exemplified, I think, too, the spirit of America. This is somebody who, as we were discussing earlier, he never had slaves, refused to have them. He did a lot of his own work himself. Right. He took pride in that. He's somebody who, prior to the revolution, was defending a British officer because he felt so highly about
Boston Massacre. Indeed.
Yep.
That's a great example. He also had a terrific marriage.
Mm-hmm. And, that's right. Absolutely. And a
terrific woman who has rightly. I think there's a society at Harvard called the Abigail Adams Society, and I'm happy to see her getting that kind of recognition. Mm-hmm. She ran the place. She ran the farm. She was like a businessman. I mean, it's incredible.
She was an extraordinary woman.
Yeah, she was. So, and in a way, Lincoln, because Lincoln, and that sounds strange to say Lincoln is so universally esteemed, but I think
even like Castro, by the way.
That's right. Well, God, forget it. He's had enough praise. But I think Lincoln's misunderstood as he's a testament to the power of moderation and incrementalism in political affairs. He set his sights in very. He understood that the Constitution, that the people like William Lloyd Garrison, the really hardcore abolitionists who were like, in a less serious way, the New York Times 1619 people that pretend to want to bring it all down, and replace it with what? But William Lloyd Garrison was a Quaker, a fiery, Christian, immediate abolitionist advocate. And he said the Constitution was a pact with the devil. Burned a copy of the Constitution publicly in Boston. And Frederick Douglass was at first a Garrisonian. He agreed with that. But Lincoln, I think, convinced him, or he became convinced that Lincoln's approach, which was to say, no freedom is going to be worth anything if it comes at the expense of the Constitution. You have to have that fundamental structure of order first. And, that's something I think if you talk to most young people now, they would not agree. They would not agree with that Lincolnian insight. They would agree, well, yeah, we got to get a new Constitution. Let's just tear it down. But keep Wi-Fi service for everybody intact, and all that. It's partly immaturity, but I think Lincoln's prudence, and the Steven Spielberg film was not bad in showing that a man of high principle could also be a pretty canny political operator. That they weren't incompatible things. But he thought the way to do this was a constitutional amendment, to abolish slavery. You had to amend the Constitution. And, we think now it's a general consensus that amending the Constitution is too difficult, so we just work around it. I think this has been very destructive. We need to have the fights about what the Constitution will be. That's part of what living in our kind of society is about.
Maybe that's the moral of the story we should end on, is that we, when we needed a Washington, we got a Washington. When we needed a Madison, we got a Madison. When we needed a Lincoln, we really needed him. There was basically nobody else who could have done that job.
Yeah.
And we got him. And there very much is this, divine destiny that seems to have blessed the United States in so many ways. Only superpower, for example, to not have to be surrounded by enemies. That's kind of a big one.
Yes, that's kind of a big one. Yes.
And it seems like when things have gotten to the point where they look like things could fall apart, we got the kinds of people that we needed. It's certainly been historically true.
Well, may it be so.
Hopefully, I hope so.
May it be so for the future, because we certainly need something other than what we've had and than what we have right now. God help us.
That's what I think. That's something we can all probably agree on. Well, Professor McClay, thank you so much. It's been amazing.
My pleasure.
Where can people find you?
Oh, well, I'm here at Hillsdale College, and you can look me up, and my email address is there, and I'm always happy to hear from people. So.
And the book is Land of Hope: An Introduction to the Great American Story.
Here. This is what it looks like.
Land of Hope: Great American Introduction.
I want to show it backwards on your screen, but yes, it's a lot of fun. I think one of the most gratifying things that people have said is that they enjoy the book. And how many people? I mean, there are people who enjoy history, but often they like history, like D-Day or some specific event or subject. And this is a sort of everything, but it's done in a very narrative way. So I'd love to hear from people who have picked it up on the basis of this show.
And we'll put in the podcast notes as well. Thanks so much, Professor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week. We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.